So basically, we're negotiating our identity depending on who we're interacting with and how that interaction goes, whether we form a positive impression or a negative impression. I think it's very important to realize that these students can take control of their own lives. They are there to negotiate their own meanings. They don't need someone else to come in and have them think critically about themselves. They're already just in everyday survival. They need to figure out, how am I going to make this decision? What am I going to do today? These are very basic things, but I think something in the presentations and talks that I've attended in the last year or two, these are issues that are coming up, but I don't see them much as issues. These just seem to be the daily struggle of living, almost. So, as a result of our individual experiences, and despite being part of a larger community, it's impossible to specifically identify or categorize a person's identity, let alone the cultural identity, because Kuwaiti culture, taking the example from my research, is comprised of all these individual identities. So how can we make an assumption about them? And using myself as an example, the issue of identity frequently crosses my mind. Regardless of the adjectives that I've used to describe myself, I'm very different from who I was 15 years ago, 5 years ago, and even just a few months ago. So it's constantly changing, depending on life circumstances and the historical events. So in terms of Kuwait and my conversations with students, there seem to be relatively mixed reactions towards globalization. While the presence of foreign industries is noticeable throughout the country, it does not seem to have a major effect on how these students view themselves as Kuwaiti. Perhaps the label of being Kuwaiti is now changing also with these additional influences. So what someone 3 generations ago thought defined what being Kuwaiti is may be very different now. So this fluid nature is also something to keep in mind. And seeing how identity is so complex, I'm actually going to end with a question, which is, does it matter? All of this has to do with globalization and cultural identity, but my third aspect of my research is, does it matter as English language teachers, whether you're an instructor or a curriculum development person, does it matter what the students' cultural identity is? And if so, how is it affecting the way we teach them? That's basically it. The rush through that. I'm just opening it up for discussion, because I mean the presentation is over, but there are a lot of ideas out there, and this is kind of where I am right now in my research, so yes, that's my question. Does it matter what someone's cultural identity is if you're an English language teacher?
I have a comment, Ayesha. You say that it doesn't matter cultural identity or whatever. Identity, and you're specifying, I think, culture is what you're looking into it. I have 2 points here that I want to put across. I think you know some of the work that's been done by Phillipson, and he says, well, now English, and he just did a study, a presentation a few months ago in the American University in Sharjah, and he says, well, English now is being brought into all of these other countries, and it has other motivations. It has basically nothing to do with the teaching of language, but it has to do with the teaching of the values and principles and everything else that goes with that. So that's one point that Phillipson, I think, would contradict the fact that it doesn't matter to have whose cultural identity.
Right.
The second thing is what's happening in Kuwait, and I'm saying this because I've toured a lot of the Arabic countries, and this is happening now in the UAE with nationalism and so forth, and they're even going back to saying, okay, so why should we learn English? Why should English be taught and not Arabic? And they're changing the whole formality of what is happening in the UAE to going back to even science. They don't want science to be just in English. It has to be Arabic. And if those who are coming in, you said 1.5 million are expats in Kuwait. They're saying, so exactly, they're saying, so why are we learning the English? Why don't they learn Arabic and come in and talk So this is happening in the whole of I think, basically the Gulf countries.
Right.
But is there a situation, I know what the background is in the UAE, but I'd like to ask you, why is this change now in Kuwait about cultural identity and these students being more their own culture? You know, they need to learn about us, whereas I think 10 years ago it was a little bit different. The more you were closer to the culture of the English language, the better you were considered. So what has that changed? What is the change that occurred? Is it politics and political? Because I know there's a lot of problems.
I think that some of it is political. However, I think it still goes back to these students that I'm talking to are at Kuwait University. It's a government-funded university. It's public. It's free for the citizens. I think it goes back to the issue of choice. The students come from different backgrounds. They have government schools which are free and taught in Arabic, and they have private schools which are English medium and other countries and nationalities and languages. So I think it doesn't just go up to the government. It's still down to individual choice and what their family is teaching them and telling them. So if someone's parent decides to put them in an English school, then that is something already from their background that they're coming with. In terms of their nationalistic attitude, I don't know, having lived in Kuwait for almost 30 years, I don't see it any different as it ever was. Perhaps now, I think that's almost my point, that it's always been there, but only now it's coming into question, maybe since the events of September 11th and the whole identity of Muslims and Arabs. They need to defend themselves, or they find the need to defend themselves. So maybe that's why their voices are just being heard louder, but I think it's always been there. And in terms of Philipson, well, one basic statement I have is if it wasn't English as an international language, it would be something else. You know, there has been established, this method of communication has been established, and it just happens to be English with all these historical connotations and denotations attached to it. But I have no research to back me up yet, but I personally believe if it wasn't English that we were all speaking at this conference, then we would have been speaking another language, and then be investigating what historical implications does that have. So there has to be a line drawn somewhere. Again, just my opinion. Is there anything else?
Yes. I just wonder if you could go back to that question, does it matter about cultural identity? And just, if you could just reiterate exactly what you meant by that. That you mean that we don't need to think about it at all anymore in teaching. I'm taking it back to the practical level of the classroom for a moment.
Right. I
And
think
materials and all of those sorts of things. Do you think it's not significant there, or are you saying it's just not significant in terms of worrying too much about the impact of globalisation generally? So I'm taking it to different levels.
It's a little bit of both. I think that there's been, I'll go back to my first experience with this thing. In March of 2003, I was at the TESOL International Conference in Baltimore, and I attended many lectures and discussion sessions, and I was horrified by what I was hearing from these English teachers saying, well, I have students who come from this country, how should I deal with them? You know, or even my own orientation session at a university in New York, where they told us that in America we use deodorant. I was so insulted. I was so insulted. So it's coming down to almost this type of foundation that it doesn't matter. I want to learn how to speak well. I want to know how to speak grammatically, in a grammatically correct manner. So I think that no, culture does not matter. If there are controversial issues, then they can be avoided. We don't need to talk about controversial issues in order to establish fluency among speakers. And in fact, by giving the students the capability to speak well, they can then read more and access more information and in fact engage in conversations which may cover controversial topics outside of the classroom.